Are the dark forces that covered up Canada's deadliest terror attack still in power, covering up murders?
This is the question I'm troubled with after meeting Bob Ray, an Albertan whose cousin was found burned to death in his vehicle in 2014. Bob believes that politically influential members of his former religion compromised the investigation into his cousin's death, and he vehemently disagrees with the autopsy report conducted by a foreign medical graduate with questionable credentials.
The police were consistent in telling myself that your cousin has committed suicide and that they will not investigate this case as a homicide because they cannot go outside of what Dr. Adeagbo has ruled in the forensic autopsy.
The records from Rocky View County Fire Services show that the RCMP investigation lasted less than 24 hours to conclude their suspected cause of Bob's cousin's death as suicide caused by explosion and fire.
This did not make sense to myself or anybody in my family, and none of us agreed that our family member would commit suicide at all. I firmly believe that my cousin was murdered and the investigation was botched due to outside influence that could be created by my political and religious opposition in Alberta, Canada at that time.
As a former member of the Sikh religion, Bob states that he was ostracized by the religion due to a family feud. He contends that the peaceful religion has been hijacked by powerful, centralized organizations. These entities, he believes, have exerted political influence to divert the Sikh community in Canada into voting blocks, potentially to serve specific agendas, thus compromising the integrity and independence of Canadian institutions, which he believes have played a major role in his cousin's death and the subsequent investigation.
At the time my cousin was murdered, I was involved in complex litigation at that time, and my opposition lawyer was the daughter of the founding president of the World Sikh Organization.
Bob links his cousin's death to the infiltration of Canadian institutions by elements connected to the Khalistani movement, a Sikh separatist group in India. This movement is infamously tied to the Air India bombing, Canada's deadliest terror attack, a tragedy largely unknown to many Canadians. Despite its scale, the masterminds behind this attack were never fully brought to justice.
Yes, they had too much political influence. The Canadian political parties and governments did not want to make mad the Sikh community in Canada. And even if it meant supporting silently their terrorism. And basically Canadian politicians just wanted to use the Sikh people in Canada as a voting bloc. And if they needed votes, they could get the World Sikh Organization or Babar Khalsa to mobilize all of their votes from the temples and make political aspirants win elections. The ramifications of having corrupt institutions that are overlooked by politicians is tremendous to the general public. This concerns public safety. In the case of Sikh, terrorist / human rights organizations operating from Canada, in the past they have committed heinous terrorist acts from Canadian soil, and no politicians have ever held any in organization or ethnic ghetto politician to any type of accountability.
Could it be that the dirty hands, powerful enough to get away with Canada's deadliest terror attack, also got away with Bob's cousin's murder? Kim Bullen's book, Loss of Faith: How the Air India Bombers Got Away with Murder, meticulously documents Canada's deadliest terror attack and the subsequent failures of Canadian institutions. It delves into the investigation's missteps, including the destruction of key evidence by CSIS, the ensuing miscarriage of justice, and the political establishment of the perpetrators within the Canadian government. Quote, "For years, those at the center of the terrorist plot tried to protect their dark secret. 2 Sikh newspaper publishers who overheard an alleged confession by one of the bombers were assassinated. Other potential witnesses were threatened and intimidated. Journalists who wrote about the suspects were targeted by death threats and harassment. The suspects founded charities and participated in political parties, attending fundraising dinners for premiers and prime ministers. And the families of the victims fought to be recognized for their unimaginable loss as the result of an act of terrorism plotted in Canada.
My cousin's mother, father, brother, anyone in the family like myself, my sisters, no one was talked to at all by the police during the investigation. The way I see Canada now is almost in a state that is worse than a developing country. There is massive corruption all across federal politics in Canada, provincial politics, going right down to municipal politics.
The autopsy report ruling the death as a suicide intensified Bob's doubts about the investigation into his cousin's death, particularly after he discovered that the foreign medical graduate who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Adeagbo, had inconsistent credentials. These inconsistencies, uncovered by our previous report on the FF12 investigation, included discrepancies in Dr. Adeagbo's employment history and the Federation Credential Verification Service's failure to verify his medical school transcripts from Nigeria.
All those things are red flags that should suggest to you, me, and the defense attorney that this expert is not qualified.
Despite these concerns, Dr. Adeagbo was involved in signing off on 5,000 autopsies in Alberta and served as an expert witness for the Crown in multiple cases.
In this situation, there is a foreign medical graduate who comes to the United States with a degree and a transcript. His degree and transcript have never been able to be verified from the university that he claims to have attended in Nigeria.
The investigation lasting only 24 hours, and the autopsy report by a questionable forensic pathologist, along with Bob's involvement in complex litigation against esteemed members of his former religion, compounded by then Alberta Chief Medical Examiner Annie Sabaga's allegations of political and bureaucratic interference in death investigations, led Bob to believe that he could be the next target.
When I read that news article, compounded with my cousin's autopsy report, I felt scared that my cousin was murdered and that I might be next. So I went to the RCMP in Chestermere and I showed them Dr. Sovago's news article. And instead of listening to me, they had me locked up in a psychiatric unit at Rocky View Hospital in Calgary. And there they kept me locked up for 6 months, and the doctors kept telling me there that as long as I talk about the Nigerian forensic pathologist, that they will not release me for 2 years. And I was eventually released after 6 months when my lawyer at the time, who was a Canadian scholar named Dr. Gary Bodding, came to visit me with his wife at Rocky View Hospital. And within the next few days, the hospital finally released me from there.
Institutionalization of people who allege government corruption and go to the RCMP seems to be not that uncommon. Bob is not the only person I've come across who has been institutionalized and recalls memories of threats and involuntary medical interventions. Another commonality is their struggle to get their voices heard in a country where the media relies on government handouts for survival.
Yes, I have routinely attempted to garner support from local media, including all of the mainstream news agencies that are funded by our federal government, but they all turned a blind eye to the serious nature of this story because my political views are outside of the parameters with the narrative that mainstream media pushes in Canada.
If Bob's suspicions are correct, that politically well-connected individuals who got away with Canada's deadliest terror attack, assassinated journalists and plotted against victims' families, can still assassinate political opposition and cover up their murders, then the integrity of Canadian public institutions is compromised. So I asked Bob if there is a politician on the horizon whom he thinks might crack down on this parallel state.
For the most part, all three political parties in Canada are morally and ethically the same, meaning that they do not function in a way with any integrity or credibility. No politicians in this country actually serve the general public. They simply serve their own agendas. I can speak on behalf of the Sikh ghettos in Canada. There are 28 of them. All 28 ghettos produce a member of parliament. So most of these members of parliament belong to either liberal or conservative, and maybe one or two inside of the NDP. But all 28 of these ghetto politicians, through intertribal relations, operate as one unit. And when you have 28 Sikh ghetto politicians with qualifications like ESL, it becomes quite troubling because, they can dictate which way the country goes. And, almost to the point of extorting leadership in this country. I see mass immigration to Canada, primarily from a handful of countries that is justified by Canadian politicians as being diversity. And this is not diversity, this is selective, massive, negligent immigration.
Since the implications of a potentially botched death investigation are so significant, I have delved deep into the background of the forensic pathologist who ruled Bob's cousin's death a suicide. According to records obtained from the United States, where the foreign medical graduate from Nigeria was previously employed before practicing in Canada, Dr. Adeagbo was unable to complete the USMLE Step 3 test within the maximum allowable limit of 6 attempts. Passing this test is a prerequisite for most state licensing boards for doctors of medicine, with an overall pass rate of 97%.
Now, in respect to hiring doctors, as they have demonstrated in the case of questionable Dr. Adeagbo, they do not do their due diligence in verifying the track record as well as the academic history of doctors, and negligently give medical licenses to people that might not even be real doctors.
Dr. Adeagbo somehow was able to take the USMLE Step 3 test a 7th time, and it seems he was granted a waiver by some states, although Louisiana denied him a medical license. This led me to question whether he applied for a waiver in Alberta. Did he disclose his license denial in Louisiana? Or did he fail to disclose that as he did in his Kansas license application? And did Alberta's authorities verify Dr. Adeagbo's transcripts from the university he claims to have graduated from, which the FCVC could never confirm? I posed these questions to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, which oversees medical practice in the province. However, the response I received did not fully address my concerns. Given Dr. Adeagbo's role as an expert witness in many criminal trials, I also reached out to the Ministry of Justice. Their response seems to suggest that as long as a judge and the parties involved approve, anyone can be utilized as an expert, regardless of whether their qualifications have been verified.
The police have a moral duty to ensure justice and protect the public, but yet their own investigations are compromised by the Ministry of Justice because they are employing questionable expert witnesses.
I tried to contact Dr. Adeagbo directly for a comment, but the hospital where he works did not provide any information about his contact details.
In the case of, having compromised or questionable forensic pathologists, this is very troubling because it directly nullifies the integrity of the Ministry of Justice.
In the case State of Kansas versus Joaquin A. Dienda, Dr. Corey May, a forensic pathologist testifying for the defense, pointed out several errors in Dr. Adeagbo's autopsy report. These errors included the incorrect use of anatomical and technical pathology terms, repeated diagnosis of the same wound, and a misalignment claim of the cervical vertebrae that was contradicted by normal x-rays. Dr. May also noted that the report mislabeled cuts as stab wounds and failed to mention the autopsy was conducted over 2 days. This testimony casts doubts on the accuracy of Dr. Adeagbo's findings. The mentally ill juvenile was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison.
The Ministry of Justice in Alberta looks after the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner as well as Crown prosecutors. And when you have a questionable forensic pathologist that might not have any credibility, and the Ministry of Justice is using him through their Crown prosecution services as an expert witness to convict people to life sentences, this is very concerning because it could lead to wrongful convictions. Anything written by a forensic pathologist that has the questionable inconsistencies and ununderstandable medical education as Dr. Adeagbo should have no rightful authority in any health department.
Bob Ray of Alberta, despite living in fear for his life, remains committed to exposing what he believes are corrupt elements undermining Canadian public institutions. He has amassed thousands of pages of well-organized documents, some alleging corruption among what he terms ghetto politicians.
Well, there is a lot of hard evidence inside of the documents that demonstrates that unqualified politicians and terrorist organizations in the disguise of human rights organizations are doing so much destruction to Canada and every single province inside of Canada that the damage is almost at a point where it is irreversible.
In my next video, I will examine Ray's allegations of corruption relating to the $2 billion Ring Road project in Saskatchewan, involving Amarjeet Sohi, the then Minister of Infrastructure and current Mayor of Edmonton.
He is one of the most highly unqualified politicians ever inside of this country. His only education is ESL and terrorism in India.
Indeed, according to multiple sources, Amarjeet Sohi's education is limited to ESL, a course for immigrants who want to learn English. According to CBC, Sohi was charged with terrorism in India. However, in an article from the Edmonton Journal, Sohi says he was never charged. This raises the question, if education and experience are not the primary criteria, what determines the appointment of an infrastructure minister?
He has served as a infrastructure and communities minister in the federal government. He has served as a natural resources minister in the federal government and a councillor and mayor for the city of Edmonton. With only an ESL education, my call to the Canadian people is vote on merit and qualifications. Do not vote on color and ghetto politics. Just because somebody has political backing or is financially able to fight elections does not mean that they will govern in a proper way and do good for the general public. Usually, ghetto politicians in Canada, most of their election funds are raised through temples and through other people from the ghetto. So the only people that benefit are one particular group of people. The rest of Canada, no one benefits from them. Everyone loses.
Questions remain about the suspicious death and the questionable investigation. I'm committed to bringing honest and balanced journalism and will keep you updated on any new developments in this story. If you would like to support my work, please consider helping me out at mediabezirgan.com/donate so that I can continue bringing you the news that matters.